Ever since the release of Red Dead, I've noticed many people wording their opinions on who the main character of the third game should be. Sadly, I've not seen the one I truly believe is the only option when it comes to a fully realized story. People's general opinions range from one of the Calendar brothers or Jenny, Black Belle, and some even claim it could be a new character altogether. Now, I'll admit that Dutch seems like a good choice at first, but this is Red Dead Redemption, and we all know Dutch is not a redeeming character. I know that there is one character, though, who would fit perfectly into place and deserves to be played. Landon Ricketts. Ricketts' birthplace and year are both never confirmed, but we can infer, based on timelines, that he's likely in his late 50s, early 60s by the time of his death. Ricketts claims to have 25 years killing men by 1911, which would mean the time he personally feels he started that life would be around 1886. I personally feel he is referring to his time spent as a legend and not his time spent shooting a gun. As the world in America became more law-oriented, he moved further west and eventually headed down to Mexico, where he became the savior to the locals. By far the most famous of the gunslingers, he's likely the fastest right-handed draw in contrast to Calloway. During Arthur and John's childhood, Ricketts was beginning to become a big name in the West. He lost his wife. This is probably why he's very protective over other people's family members. We see this in Red Dead 1, when he is more focused on saving someone than he is on helping John. Speaking of John, when meeting Ricketts for the first time, his aim was completely discredited. This is after every other character in the game who made mention was impressed by John's precision. He even tricked a group of people into believing snake oil worked due to his accuracy. My biggest evidence of this all: Landon Ricketts was the sole survivor noted during the events of the Blackwater Massacre. The toll of deaths are listed as follows: 22 outlaws and 15 Blackwater Police Department officers. So, with this in mind, let me set the story of Red Dead 3. My Red Dead Redemption 3. What I'll be telling you would be a story that has over 25 in-game years to use. As Red Dead 2 pushed to advance time, this would do that, but to a much more extreme degree. The story is created using the pieces of dialogue and text entries in mainly Red Dead 1, but also somewhat of 2. Pay attention now. The way Red Dead Redemption 3 should play out is by putting us into the shoes of a young Landon Ricketts at the age of 16 to 17 as we experience what he has seen throughout his life. He should be born in Blackwater. I'll explain why later. The player would meet the man who'd train Landon Ricketts, and, as this section is if I were writing the story, Ricketts would meet a man who adorns himself in armor just like Teddy Brown uses. It could actually be the same armor Teddy Brown would eventually use. And his way of relaying phrases would lead to Ricketts recounting this to John.
You kill peasants, you become a peasant.
Years go by with Landon being a nobody, eventually having him reaching his early 20s, losing his mentor, and now on his own. He'd be around his home when his first major act would happen. His first act as a legend should take place in Blackwater. Ricketts loses his wife, which is a character we would be able to meet and eventually find out her fate. Being that he'd be a very notable individual, she is likely kidnapped and killed. This would add further depth to him saving Luisa and others during his time in Chuparosa and throughout his life. She is likely to be grabbed up by someone he has problems with, an upcoming legend, or a group of criminals that leads to her being killed. During his adventures, multiple gangs would pop up like in any other game, including the Coulter Tobin gang, and he would likely come into contact with the great Western female legend herself, Black Belle, likely being the reason she's a sole survivor. She's comfortable talking to Arthur because she's already met with a much more skilled gunman, and knows the difference between that and a bounty hunter. I suspect Ricketts and her encounter one another, and she passes on her wisdom of explosives, hence why Ricketts uses them too.
Stand back, damn it! Here goes!
Tying into my last point, A set of stranger missions could come along in which Black Belle's current husband at the time attempts to kill Ricketts, and he unintentionally turns her into the Time-6 widow we all know. Throughout his years, Landon can encounter different people attempting to become a legend themselves, and, just like in Shadow of Mordor, different people can advance and regress throughout the story's years. As Red Dead tells a lot about the stories of the Van der Linde gang, this would eventually begin to show them from an outside point of view and from the eyes of the lawmen themselves. Firstly, one of my favorite stories that we'd see is that in 1885 a young John was almost hanged, but it said he was saved by Dutch. This event could actually take place during the story where both Ricketts and Dutch work together to save the boy from being hanged. Because remember, Ricketts doesn't start killing until 1886, so he'd have been a nobody at this point and likely not even know who he's helping. As the years progress, the Van der Linde gang would eventually become a force to be reckoned with, taking the same place as enemies like the Lemoyne Raiders and Del Lobos take in Red Dead 2. This would lead all the way up until the end of the game. No, not Marvel's, but the final mission is an obvious one. The Blackwater Massacre. Here's how, in my eyes, it would pan out. Landon Ricketts is contacted by Agent Milton, who knows that the ferry will be robbed. During this time, we will find out who ratted this plan out, and, due to the numbers of outlaws and how many Van der Lindes were cared for, I assume that there's a second gang helping out, and they ratted attempting to get Dutch's bounty. Ricketts, the player, must set up in a building, likely inside the building on the ferry docks. Eventually, blood begins to shed as Heidi McCourt is killed and the gang attempts to flee. Then, possibly one of the greatest sections in a Red Dead Redemption game will happen. Ricketts waits in hiding so he can get a proper flank as the gang gets off of the ferry. But before that can happen, the Van der Lindes and their allied gang wipe out the entire Blackwater police force that had set up. Now, Ricketts is alone. Peeking out of the doorway, Ricketts watches as Dutch, John, and everyone else begins to head off of the ferry and start to walk off the dock. And in that moment, the doors open and Deadeye activates. And when Landon starts shooting, the cutscene flashes between him and the outlaws as they're being completely and utterly wiped out in fear. During the ambush, bodies begin to drop. John, Davy, and Jenny are hit, with the last two dying later on, and Mac is incapacitated from his wounds and left behind. Hellfire sprays until Dutch can reach back and shoot Ricketts, downing him. The gang goes to escape, and Dutch hides the money and leaves Mac Callender behind instead of saving him. An injured Ricketts lays in a pile of over a dozen bodies, up until Milton shows up, helps him to his feet, and the two of them find Mac Callender injured but still alive in Blackwater. In front of Ricketts, Milton questions Mac, and, not getting what he wanted to hear, kills him in cold blood. This failure to save lives, the near-death experience, and witnessing Milton mercilessly kill Mac Callender would put a very sour taste in Landon's mouth about the world he lives in, and, unsure of what to do, he would head further west of New Austin, off to California. Ricketts' final act as a legend is in Blackwater. After this mission, the game would now transition into the full end game, which would consist of 3 separate epilogues of varying sizes. This would not only add a major amount of necessary story, but would make the way Red Dead series epilogues follow the number of games: 1-1, 2-2, and 3-3. Landon Ricketts is absent during Red Dead Redemption 2 as he is further west past New Austin. And, in my opinion, he crossed over the Redemption Mountains. This would be because he'd eventually reach Eastern California, where he would stay for 3 years. At the end of the 3 years, a massive shootout will happen in California, and Ricketts' pride will be hurt once more. Instead of going back home, he'll cross the border and go further east, so he is south of his home in Chuparosa. The arrival in Mexico would transition the player into Landon, now living in Chuparosa, begins to clear out the gangs of Mexico, as well as follows and assists a small revolution. Ricketts being in Mexico and meeting John is a gap of about 8 to 9 years. And when that finally happens, it would have a special set of cutscenes for the player. If you look in the background now, I'll set the scene. The player starts their mission by going over to the bench in Chuparosa, and Ricketts sits down. The player now watches an American arrive as 3 banditos begin to harass him. The camera follows Landon's gaze as he watches this American gun down these 3 banditos. This would eventually lead to Ricketts getting up and encountering the man and talking to him, who we'd find out is John Marston. The missions and cutscenes play out very similarly from the ones in Red Dead Redemption 1, except add a little bit more detail to the characters and lore that we already knew. The 2-part way is the same exact way as they did in the first game, and instead of following John, we follow Ricketts as he brings the cart back to Mexico. John is killed, and before 1911 can finish out, Jack, at the age of 16, and seething with anger, would leave his mom and hunt down Ricketts in Mexico. Young Jack would call back and reflect how Landon acted before he met his mentor during the time of Red Dead 3's opening story. This, coupled with the fact that he felt bad for John, would lead Ricketts to bring Jack back home to America and begin to train him as a gunman. With this in mind, when we look at Jack Marston's player model in Red Dead Redemption 1's Epilogue, his facial hair and hairstyle mimic that of Landon Ricketts. His outfit mimics that of Arthur's, and everything else mimics that of his Papa John. His face resembles Dutch a lot, but that's something for another video. During this time, Jack would act as if he's the grandson to Ricketts and make a fake name. Remember that for later on. During Jack's training, the 2 of them would actually get a father and son relationship going, which is something both of them would need. Because of this relationship, Jack would listen to Landon and decide not to go for revenge, rather, he'd go back home and take care of Abigail. Coming back to America after all these years, Landon would be convinced to go back home and return to Blackwater. Here, he would meet the author that was trying to make a book on Calloway that we meet in Red Dead Redemption 2, and get his biography started. This epilogue ends in 1914. Ricketts passes away in his sleep 1 week before the final mission of Red Dead Redemption 1's Epilogue. Remember my family. Landon Ricketts' death is in Blackwater. Rockstar has recently enjoyed putting a little bit of a twist in their recent game endings. Spoiler alert. From being Jack in Red Dead Redemption 1, being able to kill one of the protagonists in GTA 5, and becoming John in Red Dead Redemption 2, they have enjoyed changing who the player is or can be, and this could be done to a much more extreme level by letting us play as Jack Marston and finishing off his story that was set up all the way back in Red Dead Redemption 1's Epilogue. Barely a week after Ricketts, Abigail Marston also passes away. These 2 important deaths in his life so close together would hurt Jack greatly, and send him right back on his quest to hunt down Edgar Ross. The epilogue would quickly transition into a recreation of Remember My Family before answering what happens directly after the events. So let's start by going over what happens in that mission. Jack Marston goes to 3 individuals in order to hunt Edgar Ross down. He goes to a random government agent, he goes to Edgar Ross's wife, and Edgar Ross's brother. He never tells anyone except Edgar Ross his name, and with Ross being killed, no one knows the exact name of the killer, but they do know the face. Jack's plan after that is to use the fake name he was using when he acted like Ricketts' grandson, and, going to the bank, he claims all of his weapons, money, horses, etc. After an investigation, Jack is pointed out as who he really is, and is wanted, just like Dutch and everyone else was before him. An old lady, Sadie, sees a wanted poster with the name Jack Marston displayed and returns back to New Austin in order to find him and save him from the life he's putting himself into. Struggling to do it alone, Sadie gets the help of Charles, and the 2 of them work with Jack in order to save his life. I'll leave Rockstar with that one. May want to make another game with Jack, he is kind of a big figure. But the game should probably end with Jack Marston becoming an old man and writing down the story of Red Dead. A story that tells all about Landon Ricketts, John Marston, Dutch Van der Linde, Arthur Morgan, and everyone else that he's ever met in his life. This would give off the impression that the stories that we play in Red Dead Redemption games are actually Jack's book. Whew! Now that we got over a summary of the story I would put, Let's talk about the advancements in the gameplay and the map that we would see with Red Dead Redemption 3. Because I'm not just doing this with story. No, I'm writing the whole game down with gameplay and everything else in mind. From Red Dead 1 transitioning into Red Dead 2, we obtain the ability to interact with fellow gang members, though this usually is only in camp. The story passes time as the world grows around you, and people began to remember the player, like shopkeepers, though this only shows up in single player. Red Dead 3 would have the potential of advancing this tenfold. This would be accomplished by making other NPCs trying to become a Legend of the West throughout the storyline. Ricketts will be able to encounter different people and, depending on the actions of the player, befriend or antagonize different NPCs attempting to become a legend during Landon's story. This gameplay mechanic would be somewhat like Shadow of Mordor's orc system and allow different NPCs to grow and decrease in skill as the story progresses. This would allow players to find different legends in terrible situations and, depending on the relationship between Ricketts and this character, they could save their life, gun them down, have them arrested, or much more. NPCs would be able to interact with the player unlike they ever do with John and Arthur, two people who were technically nobodies. Shopkeepers could either call you a monster or the savior of the town, depending on what you do. Included with this would be the addition of an intimidation skill, in which it would cause enemies, lawmen, and pedestrians to be too afraid or too honored to attack, arrest, or call for help. During their time as young Landon Ricketts before any fame, enemies will act as if they do in Red Dead 2 and Red Dead 1, in which they do not interact with the player beyond calling them out, and just try to kill them. Eventually, through the story, Ricketts would get more popular and more notable, and enemies, NPCs, lawmen, etc. would begin to call him out and form unique dialogue where they call out events that he has done. Looking at the screen right now, you can see what I mean by example. Rockstar would be able to change out what the characters say very slightly by changing the names and the events based on what the player did. As Landon begins to age, we would follow him as his skill in climbing, shooting, running, etc. begins to grow, and during the later ends of the story, it would start to fall off as his debilitating age gets the better of him. This would be a unique thing that we haven't really seen a lot in video games. It'd be very immersive to be able to grow as Ricketts and watch him climb faster and shoot better and reload quicker. And eventually, as he ages, we would hear him struggle to do things that he was doing not too long ago in the story during his time in his 20s. Let's talk about honor for a minute. In Red Dead Redemption 1, John's honor can go from hero to drifter to desperado, with a few different varying places in between. This is slightly different from Arthur's, which is only in color, and it slides red to gray. Now, you can argue that gray is only in place of blue, but I'm pretty sure it's deeper than that, and it symbolizes that Arthur can never be fully redeemed and will always be a drifter, at least. This would be reflected in Red Dead 3, where the player's honor as Landon could only go from gray to blue, having it play out in the way that Landon actually is, or choosing to be closer to the bad from the good, the bad, and the ugly. With a new Red Dead comes a new section of the map, and with Red Dead 2 pushing eastwards, we should counter that by moving west. Recently, Rockstar has enjoyed moving the player from the normal area and forcing them somewhere else for a few missions, like Gorma. And, if you remember, during the events of Red Dead 2 and leading up until 1902, Ricketts leaves further west to California, where more of the story will take place. This can also happen during his time in Mexico, but for now we're only going to talk about the type that would expand the map. If you look in the background now, you'll see a crudely drawn map made by me, in which I've advanced where I think it should go. A path should be added just over the Redemption Mountains and cut you over east, and after a little bit of a ways, you end up in California. They can also add a tunnel at the west of Gaptooth Breach in order to make a second entrance to California. This can be finished after the transition past 1911. A hugely understandable point of contention would be that it is wrong to reassign a character who has lost their voice actor. But, in this case, Ricketts would already have to sound different as he is much younger and progresses all the way up until 50s to 60s, depending on his age at death. Through a couple of facts I'm about to share, Rockstar has showed that they care a lot about not only the voice actor, but the character of Landon Ricketts himself. In Red Dead Redemption 2, Mount Hagen is directly named in honor of Landon's voice actor, Ross Hagen. And did you catch that? His first name just happens to be Ross. During his time when meeting John, he references a fondness of Schofields, yet he only has a cattleman in Mexico. This could reference that he leaves his stuff back in America. During the events of Red Dead Redemption 2, Landon Ricketts is nowhere to be seen because he has actually went away. This was referenced in Red Dead Redemption 1, and the writing team has stayed consistent with it when there have been some stuff they're not too consistent about.
I had a daughter.
During Red Dead Redemption 1's multiplayer, he was really being pushed out. He had game art, he had his own zombie Ricketts when Undead Nightmare came out, which kinda mirrored zombie Marston. And Rockstar eventually gave his model away for free in its own unique pack. When asked, Landon says his reason for going to Mexico was to live quietly. But he was kinda called out by John, as he's living in the past, but not just in his head, attempting to in his real everyday life. Let's talk about Landon and Blackwater. With the story going the way I wish it to, Ricketts would be born and begin to start as a legend in Blackwater before going other places and eventually coming back to stop with the Blackwater Massacre. He disappears again, but eventually comes right back to Blackwater for his death. The thing is, 2 of these are already canon. Now let's talk about something I really gotta get off my chest. The Calendar brothers and Jenny are bad choices for the main character. Having it be between Jenny and Davy would lead to the player eventually being shot by Ricketts and bleeding out with the gang. This would probably transition you into playing as Arthur and would set up the second game, but go nowhere after that. Also, I can't see Jenny or the Calendar brothers having a huge redemption arc in their life and then just get gunned down in the Blackwater Massacre. Now let me talk about Mac, because I've seen a couple posts and I've seen a video and a lot of people agree that it should be Mac. But if Rockstar chose this character, it would mean that they were oh so close of picking the right one and failed to realize what would have truly brought the story all the way to a close. At least for the Vanderlins. The reason I say this is because Mac Calendar was shot by Landon Ricketts, still alive, and then killed by Milton in front of Ricketts. If it went out this way, it makes more sense. Having the player die as Mac right then and there would transition them over to his brother or Jenny before they die, and then over to Arthur. Or just skip them and jump to Arthur. But I don't think we should be jumping to Arthur. We know his story and he only sets up John's. Ricketts watching this event will lead to him going to California and eventually Mexico, where he'll meet Jack and set up his story. During our times in Red Dead 1 and 2, it can be inferred that the player is actually killing a lot of people. Both John and Arthur have times where they word their issues with taking so many lives, and the only other character who's done this is Landon Ricketts. Alright, come on guys, come on. Let's be real here. Ain't gonna be no story DLC. But a great callback to the old Liberty City stories would be the addition of 2 separate stories that also follow along with Landon's somewhat, and would flesh out parts of events. Starting off, the game would mainly be about Landon Ricketts. That one's an obvious one. But story number 2 would take you for a little bit of a ride as you play as Dutch van der Linde in a very short story, not about redemption, but about the events that made him lose his mind and turn him into the man that John would eventually encounter on top of the mountain in Cochene. Lastly, who do you think we should have as a third character? Who set up someone's story so much that they're a big figurehead, even if you don't want him to be? Milton? No. Milton was a nobody. It would truly have to be Edgar Ross. The long speeches he gives to John plus his ruthlessness makes me believe that he got Milton to act the way he did. With these 3 characters in mind, they would be major figureheads in Jack's life, with Landon being his trainer, Dutch possibly being his real father, and Edgar Ross ruining his life. This will further on to the idea that every major Red Dead character all links back to Jack. Oh, that was a lot to take in. But I hope that clearly shows why Landon Ricketts is Rockstar's best pick for the third game. Red Dead Redemption's story has been going backwards and following the protagonist till death. Landon Ricketts' story starts before any others and ends after most we know. He has interacted either directly or indirectly with most of the main Red Dead characters. Just like the two main characters, John and Arthur, Landon Ricketts has notably killed a lot of individuals, possibly even more than the two we play as. This would obviously be because Landon Ricketts partakes in more missions than both John and Arthur would combined. He is leagues above the skills of any character we have ever seen when it comes to shooting, likely possessing the best form of Deadeye yet. Being the most notable legend, there's no doubt he has seen his fair share of strange faces over a long amount of years. The Blackwater Massacre would end his story and transition into Epilogue 1, directly setting up Red Dead Redemption 2 by showing us 1. How the lawmen knew the ferry was going to be robbed, and 2. The death of Heidi McCourt, Jenny, and the Calendar brothers, without being extremely direct during cutscenes. These would be perfect for the kind of suspense and emotion Rockstar is known for, and for players invested in the Van der Lindes, as you would view the gang from a perspective that we have only heard, and you would even fire against them. Landon Ricketts is by far the best choice Rockstar could ever make when it comes to releasing Red Dead Redemption 3. Disagree? Let me know what you think in the comments, and, if enough differing opinions, I'll make another video responding to the feedback.
But they do have his sister. Emilio's, I mean. She's a fine young woman, a teacher, a human being. Not the clothed vermin so many people seem to have turned into.
Tell him I'm sorry.
When a man's family is involved, you need a little more enthusiasm than mere apologies.
I have enough worries, sir. This man's problems pain me, but they're not quite my own.
Those who sit on the fence make a choice, in their own way. Don't you think, Mr. Marston?
Of course. And what about you, Ricketts? A man living in the past? Man who ran away from home? What choice did you make?
I'll tell you what choice I made. I'm a fighter, sir, and I'll fight to the end. I think we should get going.